All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for Teves. To thank the Daf Yomi Shiur for dedicating all the Shiur and Midrashos this month in memory of Mr. Marder, Mordechai Dovid ben Rephael HaKohen. We hope that in the merits of our Talmud Torah, the neshama will have an aliyah in the family in neshama. To thank Shirley Elbaum and family for dedicating all the Shiur and Midrashos this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Gerald Elbaum, Yaakov Kopel, Ben R Avraham Menachem. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Paul's sister Leah Bas Shmuel. Ayal Sara Steinberg, in the zechus of refuah shelaimah for Shulamis Bas Susha, and our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Michael Edinger, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Lehrer Marcus Rapp, great-great-grandfather of Binyomin Edinger. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, the families in neshama, all of those who require refuah should have one together with kol cholei yisrael. I will say with that, let us begin. We have a really interesting daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is daf ayin, and we are picking up Meretz Hashem on ayin. We actually made some good headway in the daf. We are actually picking up today 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 lines up from the bottom. Right? So I know a of 78, 16 lines up from the bottom. Tashma. So if you remember again, we're actually dealing, the question that the Gemara was asking was the following question, Rabbi's question. Kiyem lechi hayom. So what happens if the husband says to his wife, or the father says to the daughter, I affirm this neder for you today. I affirm this neder for you today. So we'll say, how do we understand that particular statement? Ultimately, again, does that mean that the neder is affirmed today and revoked tomorrow, or not? So in the course of answering that particular question, so the Gemara asked the whole series. Okay, don't spend. It's fine. In the course of answering that question, so the Gemara has asked the whole series of other questions. The last question I will say the Gemara asked was, Kiyem lechi shah. What happens if a husband says to his wife, I uphold this neder for you for the next hour? So the next hour. So halacha l'maisa again, does that, in other words, what happens? Is the neder upheld for an hour and then revoked or annulled the next hour? So I will say, so that's what we're talking about over here. So Tashma, interesting case. Harini Nazira. So again, we have not answered any of these questions. We still have to deal with all of them. So Tashma, Harini Nazira, B'shama Bailava Amar Ani. So listen to this. A woman says, I am a Nazira. Thank you. So I am a Nazira. Right? So ultimately, again, that's the neder that she's making. I'm a Nazira. Her husband hears it, and what does he say? Va'amar Ani. He says, me too. So what's the halacha? Ein yachal hafer. He is unable to go ahead and annul her neder. So we'll say, so once again, she's saying, I'm making a neder, I'm becoming a nazira. Then what happens? He says, me too. Once he says, me too, he can't annul her neder. Va'amai. Why not? Neima va'ani da'amar hu al nafshe da'havi nazir. So why not? Why can't he say like this? When I said va'ani means, the husband says, means I also want to become a nazir. Aval harini nazira dila d'sha'achas kaima la'achar shah ibay lefer. So we'll say, so ultimately again, when it comes to her neder, why can't they say, look, I was just affirming your neder for a little bit, so that I could kind of piggyback on it, but then I plan on annulling your neder an hour later. Why can't he do that? In other words, remember again, this is all assuming that the window for affirmation and revocation is on that day. So again, here's the case. Wife says, Harini Nazira. Husband says, Vani, me too. The Brisa says, after he says Vani, he can no longer annul her neder. Why not? Why can't he say, I was just simply affirming your neder enough so that I could piggyback on it. But once I piggyback on it, afterwards I reserve the right to go ahead and annul it an hour later, as long as it's all still on the same day. Why can't he do that? It must be that what? Lav mishum, tekevan tekaimo kaimo. It must be that what? That halacha l'maisa, because once you affirm a neder, I will say what? Once you affirm it, we're done. Right? Neder closed. In other words, once you affirm it, the window for affirmation, revocation has now closed, and the entire process is finished. So we'll say, so that's a raya to the case that we had before, that if a husband were to say to his wife, Kiyem lechi shah, I affirm your neder for an hour, that he can't go back and negate it or annul it afterwards, because once the neder has been upheld, that's it. To which the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Lo kasavar kol va'ani kiman da'amar kiyem lechi lo'olam. Not necessarily. So in other words, it could very well be that any time that a husband says va'ani, and I also want to latch on to this, any ani ultimately again is like complete affirmation. Right? In other words, that any time that a husband is embedding himself in his wife's neder, or kind of riding the wave of his wife's neder, right? Piggybacking on his wife's neder, by definition what he's doing is he's affirming it. It's a complete affirmation. So again, it could very well be, the Gemara suggests, maybe you can affirm a neder for an hour and then revoke it after an hour. That's possible. But either way, you can't bring a raya from this case, because in this particular case, halacha l'maisa, once you say va'ani, that's like engaging in a complete affirmation. So therefore, I will say, we have a number of open-ended questions to which this Gemara ends off with. So let's resolve them from the Rambam. So the Rambam in Hilchos Nedarim Perek Yud Gimel, Halacha Chaf Bey says as follows. Here we go. Here are the cases. Amar La, Kiem Lach Sha'achos V'Avra Hayom V'Lo Hefer Harei Zakayim. So we'll say, so first of all, if a husband goes ahead and affirms the neder, he says, this is actually working backwards, right? This is the last case. Last case was, I affirm your neder for an hour. For an hour. We do not interpret that to mean, I affirm it for an hour, and after an hour it's automatically revoked. Rather again, if you don't say anything about revocation, then what? We don't assume revocation occurred. So why did you frame it as an hour? Whatever, that's what you're talking. But l'maisa, if he affirms a neder for an hour and doesn't do anything to revoke it, halacha l'maisa, the neder is affirmed. Vein omrim shezek misha amar lo hafar harei mufar lech la'achar shah shar lahotzi hafara mipiv. Good. So I say, now watch this. That's case one. So that's our last case that we had. The Gemara says, amar lo kim lechi shah achos. What happens? Well, so let's work backwards. What happens if he says to her, the neder is affirmed for an hour, right? Kiem lechi sha'achos, kisha avra, hasha amar la mufralech. We'll say, so what happens in the following case? So case one, which is the last case we just dealt with, which is if a husband says to his wife, I affirm this neder for you for an hour. So we'll say, what's the result of that statement? Complete affirmation. Complete affirmation. Why? He only said an hour. It's fine. He didn't say he's revoking anything. As long as he didn't say he's revoking anything, therefore Allah Chalamayis, the affirmation stands. What happens if he says, Ki mechisha achos ukisha avrasha amar mufarlach? Okay. Then we'll see the next case is, what if he says to her, I uphold your neder, I affirm your neder for an hour, and then after an hour he says, I revoke the neder. So I'll say, what happens in this case? The Rambam writes, Harei ze safek. So I'll say, this is the interesting Safek case. Why is this a Safek case? Because I will say, it seems to be that halacha l'maisa, the Rambam says that once you affirm a neder, that affirmation stands. The question just becomes in a situation where you exercise the right of revocation within the window of the same day. So halacha l'maisa, can you affirm and then revoke within the same day? So the Rambam says that's Safek. We're not sure what to do in that case. And therefore, again, what do you do in a Safek neder? Ulefichach asura binidra. Ultimately, again, she's bound by the neder, but if she violates the neder, the Rambam writes, she doesn't get malchus. Okay, so therefore, again, those are the last two cases of Bose. So again, halacha l'maisa, he affirms the neder for an hour. We don't interpret that to mean affirmed for an hour and then automatically revoked afterwards. Rather, affirmation is affirmation. That's number one. Number two, if he says affirmed for an hour, then after an hour he does revoke it, that's a Safek case. Beautiful. I will say Mishnah. So Meisa'av. So we'll say this is all still the same exact sugya. Right? All the same sugya of the Nara Hamurasa. Here we go. Mishnah, bottom of Ayin Adalef. Meisa'av, if the father dies, lo nisrokna reshus labal. So we'll say, we actually mentioned this before. Right? If the father dies, ultimately, again, the rights of the father do not yield back to the husband. I should say, are not inherited by the husband. Meisabal, but if the husband dies, nisrokna reshus la'av. Ultimately, again, the rights of full revocation do go back to the father. So I will say, so again, remember, Nara Amurasa, in order to be made for her neder, both father and husband need to participate in that revocation. Right? So now what the Gemara said, what the Mishnah is saying is, if the father died, husband does not inherit rights of revocation from the father. If husband dies, father does inherit rights of revocation from the husband. Bazeh yofa koach ha'av mi koach ha'bal. We're both saying, in this respect, the rights of the father are stronger than the rights of the husband. So we'll say, so again, in other words, what we just mentioned, a father has greater rights than a husband. Good. But davar acher, yafek koach ha'ba mi koach ha'av. We'll say in other areas, so ultimately, again, the husband will have greater rights than the father. Where is that? Shabal mefer bebagar, v'ha'av ino mefer bebagar. So we'll say, for example, that a husband has the ability to annul the vows of his wife, who is a bogeres. Yet, remember again, a father has no rights of revocation in his daughter, who is a bogeres. I will say, bepashtos, just on a simple level, what this means is, if a father has a daughter, the daughter is not married, she becomes a bogeres. What rights does a father have in his bogeres daughter? The answer is zero. Yeah, I mean not zero, but Lamaisa, he has no rights of, because remember, once she becomes a bogeres, she's a full-fledged adult. As a full-fledged adult, ultimately he has no rights of revocation. A husband obviously has rights of revocation in his wife's Nedarim, no matter how old she is. Incredible. So I will say, so in one respect, the father has greater rights than the husband, namely, that in this case of Nara HaMurasa, if the husband dies, father acquires full rights of revocation. Yet if father dies, husband does not acquire full rights of revocation. But yet, again, in another respect, husband has greater rights, in that a husband has the ability to annul the vows of his bogeres wife, but a father does not have the ability to annul the vows of his bogeres daughter. Sorry. Okay, so we'll say good. So says the Gemara, my timer. So we'll say, what is the reason for this? My time, Adamakra benuareha beis avia. So we'll say, so what the Gemara is asking is like this: Why is it that when the father dies, we're kind of going a little bit reverse. Why is it when the father dies, the full rights of revocation don't go back to the husband? That's the shayla. So we'll say, so the Mishnah says, the Gemara answers, what's the reason why when the father dies, his rights of revocation do not go to the husband? My time, Adamakra benuareha beis aviha. When Pasuk says when she is a nara, she is in her father's home. So we'll say, interesting, how does the Gemara interpret this? So if you look at the Ran, we'll say, so the Ran is 2, 4, 6 lines up from the bottom, left-hand side of the page. My time alone is labal. Why is it that when the father dies, his rights don't go back to the husband? Kimo la'av. My time, next one, mashma. Afagav delese la'av akati ise beis avia. So what's a fantastic drasha? The Gemara understands over here, benu areha beis aviha means like this, that when she's an ara, she's in her father's home. What's the chiddush? Even if her father's not alive, she is still halachically considered to be in her father's home. What does that mean, to be in her father's home? That her father has rights in her, even if he's no longer alive. This is the raya that when the father dies, his revocation rights do not go to the husband. Even upon his death, she is still considered to be beveis avia. But if you take a look at the Rush on the bottom of the page, the Rush says, "My taima lo nisrokna rishus labal dahavilan lamigmar bal me'av damar krabi no arabe say demashma beis aviha velo beis baila." Shabbos said, this is really interesting. So apparently, again, a girl, and again, this is dafke nara. A nara is considered to be part of her father's home, even though her father is no longer alive. Therefore, the Gemara is suggesting that is why when father dies, his rights are not assigned to the husband. His rights, so to speak, still remain ultimately, again, his own. Obviously, he can't exercise them, he's dead. But Lamaisa, they remain his own. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Umei sabal nisrokna rishos la'av. Yet Rabbi said, we know that if the husband dies, his rights are ultimately, again, assigned to the father. To which the Gemara says, Minalan. Now, where do we know that from? Now, Rabbi said, take a look at the last rush on the page. Last rush, Uminalan dinisrokna rishos la'av. To have a mistaber lemeimar kevan shetzamir shuso sha'achos shalo hayu yachal lahafer levado shuv lo tachser l'shuso. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, so from where do we know From where do we know that if the husband dies, his rights are assigned to the father? To which the Gemara says, so Minalad Amar Rabba da Amar Kra Vim Hayo Sihiyeh Leish Unedareha Aleha. I will say the pasuk says, if Hayo Siyeh, if she will be married to a man, Unedareha Aleha, her Nedarim are upon him. Nedareha Aleha. So we'll say, so what does this mean? Nedareha Aleha, her Nedarim are upon her. So what does this mean? Makish, we'll say Amar Beis, Makish. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. Here's what the Gemara is picking up on. Im hayosiyeh is a double lashon of marriage, right? Remember again, we saw this before. Haviyah is lashon kiddushin, so hayosiyeh is a double lashon of kiddushin. So I will say, so what does this mean? What's the double lashon of kiddushin? It's coming to equate ultimately again first kiddushin with second kiddushin. Now, what does this mean? Take a look at the top ran for just a moment. We're going to look at the Rosh and the Ran. So the Ran says, "Makish havir rishon l'shniya kilomar shedin shniya kedin rishona ma kol me rishona av mefer l'chodei." So we'll say, now listen to this. Essentially, what the Gemara is learning out is like this: the fact that the pasuk says hayos sihiyah indicates that there are two acts of kiddushin being mentioned in the pasuk. So the Gemara is coming to equate the rights of the father prior to the second kiddushin with the rights of the father prior to the first kiddushin. Now I will say, what are the rights of a father prior to the first kiddushin of his daughter? What are his rights? Complete rights of revocation. So too the Gemara wants to suggest that halacha l'maisa, if the rights of the father prior to the second kiddushin. I will say, now what's the case of second kiddushin? What's the case of second kiddushin? This is a case of where a girl was betrothed to husband number one, and then what happened? He died. Now she's quote unquote prior to second kiddushin. Now I will say, if the father has rights prior to second kiddushin, what does that mean? That means that when husband dies, Aros dies, what happens to his rights? They go back to the father. So the fact that the father is still a player, a force, within his daughter's Hafaras Nedarim, prior to her second kiddushin, tells us that when husband dies, husband's rights are ceded back to the father. Look inside the Ran once more. Kilomar, Shedin Shniya Kedin Rishona. The din of the father's rights before the second kiddushin are like the din of the father's rights before the first kiddushin. Just like before the first marriage, the father has the ability to annul by himself. So too before the second kiddushin, nami la'achar misas habal lo mefer lechudei. So too after the death of the husband, now again the death of the first aros. Ultimately, again, now before the second kiddushin, the father has exclusive rights. So let me just frame this once more. So remember again, here's what we're doing. We're trying to figure out. Mishnah said, husband dies. So let's just frame the case, right? So Rachel is done erison with Ruvain. So now Rachel has a husband Ruvain and a father. We'll just call him father. Now what happens? Well, say in a typical case during erison, and Rachel is a nara, 12 years old to 12 years old in 6 months. Now, I will say, in a typical case, Rachel made a vow. How is that vow annulled? Father and Ruvain, right? Jointly annul the vow. Now, I will say, the Mishnah says, what happens if Ruvain dies? So we went through before that if father dies, Ruvain does not inherit his rights of revocation. Now, I will say, what happens if Ruvain, the husband, dies? What did the Mishnah tell me? Ruvain, the husband, dies. Who inherits full rights of revocation? Father. The Gemara says, how do you know that? To which the Gemara says, it's a pasuk. Hayo sihiyeh leish unedareha aleha. The pasuk itself is talking about the situation of vim hayo sihiyeh leish. Now we'll say hayo sihiyeh is two lashonos of kiddushin. If she will be married to a man, unedareha aleha miftas fasel, so a man annulment of nedarim. So we'll say, so now watch this. What's the two cases of kiddushin to which a father is still involved? To which, is it time already? One more minute. Okay. Good. So let's go. So So we'll say, what are these? Good. Ready for the day. Okay. So we'll say, so now, what ultimately, again, are the two cases of Kiddushin? So here we go. The cases are like this. The case will be where, again, Rachel has Kiddushin with husband number one, right? And then husband number one dies. Husband number one dies. Now, she has Kiddushin with husband number two. So I will say, what the Gemara is suggesting is, just like before Kiddushin number one, father has complete rights of revocation, so too before Kiddushin number two, father has complete rights of revocation. Now, in order for father to have complete rights of revocation before Kiddushin number two, we'll say what has to happen. What has to happen is that when the husband dies, he yields complete rights, or the father inherits complete rights of revocation. So this is the raya. The fact that we're comparing pre-Kiddushin 1 with pre-Kiddushin 2 ultimately tells me that what? That when the husband dies, father inherits complete rights of revocation. Incredible. So we'll say that's the entire drasha. So makish kol me'avir shniya lo kol me'avir rishona ma kol me'avir rishona av mefer lechudei. Just like before Rachel's first Kiddushin, the father has complete rights. Av kol me'avir shniya av mefer lechudei. Ultimately, before the second Kiddushin, father also has complete rights. But I will say, remember again, the difference of pre-first Kiddushin and pre-second Kiddushin is what? A little detail, which is called a husband, right? In other words, you had Reuven there in the middle. Reuven was there, then Reuven died. The fact that father has complete the same revocation rights prior to second Kiddushin only works if what? If you say that when husband dies, father inherits those complete rights. But whether you understand, I'm using the word inherit loosely, not as like halachic inheritance, but just as acquiring those rights. Good. So we'll say that's the raya. So we'll say, so now watch this. So just understand what we have so far. Well, let's finish up. Maybe this only applies ultimately again to Nedarim. Ultimately, that's what? That Allah the Aros didn't know about. In other words, we'll say, maybe it's only referring ultimately to Nedarim that the Aros himself didn't know about. Aval ben Nedarim, Shenira la Aros. Lo matzi mefer av, but maybe the Nedarim that the husband didn't know about, and let's say didn't act on, or knew about them, but didn't do anything about them. Maybe once he dies, the father doesn't have rights of revocation. Even Nedarim shlo nira la'aros b'menorah beis avia nafka. I will say ultimately, if it's talking about Nedarim that the Aros didn't know about, then of course those are within the purview of the father. That's learned out from the pasuk. Ultimately, again of menorah beis avia. Take a quick look at the Rush. Maybe about 12 lines into the Rush. The Mashma, Kol Yumei Nu'ureha, Hibir Shus Aviyah, Kol Zman She'ein Rishus Achar Sholet Aleha, U'lechala Bachos B'Nedarim Shlo Niru La'aris. So we'll say, ultimately again, obviously if the Aris didn't know about Nedarim, of course the father has sole revocation powers over those. So we'll say, the Chiddush of Yosiyah is that even for Nedarim that the Aris did know about, if the Aris dies, father has complete revocation powers over them. So therefore, we'll say, let's stop here for just a moment and let's assess what we have. What do we have? So we'll say we've now established and proven the first 12 halachas of the Mishnah. Halacha number one is that if father dies, husband does not acquire his rights of revocation. Where do we know that from? Minuareha beis aviha. She remains as part of her father's home, even if her father is no longer alive. That's number one. Number two, if husband dies, ultimately father does acquire rights of revocation. Where do we learn that out from? V'imhayo sihiyah li'ish. The Mishnah is talking, the Torah's pasuk is talking about 2 acts of Kiddushin, and yet father still maintains revocatory power before his daughter's second Kiddushin. Well, the only way for that to work, we're comparing father's rights before first Kiddushin with father's rights before second Kiddushin. Just like before first Kiddushin, father has complete revocatory power, so too before second Kiddushin, father has complete revocatory power. In order to say that father has complete revocatory power before second Kiddushin, Rabbi say, what fact has to be in place? Namely that what? That when husband dies, father inherits those rights. So Rabbi say, now we've effectively proven those first 2 points. Let's go weiter. So Rabbi says, remember again, the Mishnah said, the first part of the Mishnah is an illustration of how the father has greater rights than the husband. Then the Mishnah says, but there is a way in which what? In which the husband has greater rights than the father. How so? How so, I will say? Because remember, again, a father doesn't have revocatory power in his daughter who is a bogeres. Yet a husband does have revocatory power with his wife who is a bogeres. To which the Gemara says, okay, hechidami. So I'll say, what's the case? Look at Rashi. Look at the Ran. Almost right across in the Ran. Shabal mefer bebagar. What's the case, right? What's the case that we say that a husband has the ability to annul the vows of his wife who is a bogeres? So I'll say, so ilema shekitcha kishinara ubagra. If you tell me it's a case of where he was mekadesh when she was a nara, and ultimately then she became a bogeres. Okay, so the Gemara says michti. So if that's the case, so I'll say now the chiddush is that even though now she became a bogeres, he has the ability to go and annul her vows. If that's the chiddush, so I don't understand michti misa motzia ubagros motzia. So I will say actually the Bach adds in over here misa motzia mirshus av. Ultimately, and I will say death removes her from the domain of her father. Ubagros motzia mirshus av. And becoming a bogeres removes her from the rishus of her father. Ma misa lo nisrokno rishus labal. So what I would say is, just as death of the father does not yield the father's rights to the husband, af bagros lo nisrokno rishus labal. So what I would say also same thing. Maybe when she becomes a bogeres, also the rights shouldn't be yielded to the husband. Ella, rather I will say, what do you have to say? What's the case? Shekidsha kishi bogeres. The other Rebbe say must see that the Mishnah's case is that what happened? The husband was mekadesh his wife when she was already a bogeres, and the chiddush is Rebbe say that even though he's being mekadesh now understand when if a man is mekadesh woman as a bogeres, right? Rebbe say right if you're mekadesh woman as a bogeres, what rights do her father? What rights does her father have in her in bagrus? None. So we'll say. So the interesting chap over here is. So let's say Reuven marries Rachel, and Rachel's a bogeres. So the interest, what the Mishnah is saying is what? Is that Reuven has rights in Rachel that the father does not have in Rachel. Namely what? The father already had no revocatory power when she became a bogeres. Yet Reuven, when he marries her, has the ability to annul her vows as a husband, even though she is a bogeres. To which the Gemara says, okay, that's fine. Hatanina chadazimna. But we already learned this concept that a husband has the right to annul his vows of his wife who is bogeres. We already learned this. I will say, where did we learn this? We learned this in Mesechus Ksubis. Habogeres shisha sigid beis chodesh. So we'll say, if you remember again, we learned this in Mesechus Ksubis. And we'll say that halacha l'maisa after. Here, actually, let's take a look. So we'll say actually. Fine. So let me just say this outside. We actually remember also we had this in Mesechus Ksubis that halacha there was often 12 months between Erusin and Isuin, and after 12 months, if the husband did not marry the wife, what would happen? It would trigger the support clause. Right now, he's obligated to support her. Well, once he's obligated to support her, he also has what? Revocatory power over her vows. So essentially what the Gemara is saying is, so let me get this straight. The Mishnah over here is coming to teach me that Allah Chalamaisa, a husband has the right to revoke the vows of his wife who is a bogeres. Okay, that's interesting, but we already learned that. We've learned already in Mesechus Ksubis that Allah Chalamaisa, a husband, once he's obligated to support her, has revocatory power over her vows. So if we already learned it there, why do we need to repeat it over here? To which the Gemara says, so we'll say, here's the problem. Hagufa kashya. Amris habogeres shasa shnemas hachodesh. The bogeres lama li shnemas hachodesh. Bogeres belamid yom sagila. So Shabbos say, now listen to this. The problem with that general statement Shabbos say is it's a problem. Why does a bogeres need 12? Shabbos say, this is going back to our Ksuvas days. Remember again, Shabbos say, why ultimately again was 12 months given for a girl between Erusin and Isuin? So there were two components to it. Number one was to give the husband time for the chasana, but also more importantly, to give the girl time to acquire her adornments, her clothing, everything she needed to get married and for married life. And I will say, the assumption was that by the time a girl was a bogeres, right? By the time a girl was a bogeres, she was already ready for marriage. In other words, she had anticipated getting married maybe already as a nara. It didn't materialize as a nara, but she certainly had everything. So we'll say, how long does a bogeres need in order to get married, to get ready for a wedding? How long does she need? 30 days. 30 days. So first off, the Gemara says, why are you giving a bogeres 12 months? Right, a Bogeres only needs 30 days. To which the Gemara says, you're right, Tani, Bogeres, Visheshasa Yedbeis Chodesh. The Gemara says, okay, calm down, right? So just read a little bit differently. It's two cases. A Bogeres after 30 days, or Inara after 12 months. But what's the point? What's the point, Rabbi say? A Bogeres after 30 days, if the man did not marry her, what's the halacha? He's obligated to support her. As a result of the support clause, he's entitled to what? To revoke her vows. A Nara, after 12 months, if he didn't marry her, he's obligated to support her, and he has the ability to revoke her vows. At the end of the day, Miko Makam Kasha. Rabbi said, the question we asked is still, Rabbi said, what was the question we asked? The Mishnah makes it sound like it's a big chiddush that it's teaching us. What's the big chiddush? That a husband, a man who marries a Bogeres, has revocatory power over the vows of his Bogeres wife. Fantastic. Gemara says, only one problem. We learned that already. So why is our Mishnah restating a halacha that we already learned back in Maseches Ksubis? To which the Gemara says, Mikol Makam Gasha, Ibai Seima Hacha Dafka, Ubogeres Katani Hasa Mishum Debayi Flugirvaz of Rabbanan. So I will say, it could very well be as follows. It could very well be that halacha l'maisa here in our case, in our Mishnah, is dafka where the ikar halacha is being stated. Hacha dafka. Here is where the ikar halacha about a husband having revocatory powers over his Bogeres wife's Nedarim. This is where the ikar halacha is being stated. And I will say it could be that halacha l'maisa, the only reason that it was mentioned beforehand is to teach me about the machlokes between Rebbe Elazar and the Rabbanan. Rebbe Elazar, if you take a look at the Ran over here, the Ran says Ibai Sema. It's about 8 lines from the bottom. Bogeres Dafka Hadaka Dafka Vadik Tanei Hasa Mishum Debayi Flugir Rebbe Elazar Rabbanan Mishum Achi Hadir Tan Lashmina Delav Divrei HaKolhi. So Rebbe Elazar, so interestingly enough, what the Gemara is suggesting is as follows. What the Gemara is suggesting is there is a machlokes Rebbe Elazar and the Rabbanan ultimately about this din, about whether or not what happens after 12 months. So I will say, so what the Gemara is suggesting is like this. So just remember, no one's disputing the bottom line fact. What's the bottom line fact? That a husband has rights to revoke the Nedarim of his Bogeres wife. And that is a right that a husband has, that a father does not. So that's the takeaway. All the Gemara is bothered by is, but we already learned that a husband has revocatory power in his Bogeres wife. We already learned Ksuvas. Why are you restating it here? So now we're just trying to answer, why is the concept stated twice? So the first answer the Gemara is giving is, you're right. Here, Abba is saying, our Mishnah, this is where the Ikar Halacha is being stated. That a husband has revocatory power in his wife's Nedarim. Why is it stated in Maseches Ksuvas? Because I will say there's a machlokas about what happens after 30 days for a Bogeres, or after 12 months for an Ara. That's a machlokes Rebbe Elazar and the Rabbanan we're not going to get into right now. So that's why it's stated over there. But it's not stated over there to convey the halacha. The halacha is conveyed over here. There it's just stated in order to frame a machlokes in Rebbe Elazar and the Rabbanan. Okay. Ibai Sema, the other possibility is, Ibai Sema, Bogeres Dafka. No. Maybe the Mishnah in Ksubas Rebbe Elazar is Dafka where the halacha is taught. Namely, that a husband has revocatory power in the Nedarim of his Bogeres wife. Va'aidi de nasiv reisha bazeh, nasiv seifa nami bazeh. And I will say over here, it's just being brought down in order to maintain Mishnaic symmetry. I will say, what's the Mishnaic symmetry? Because if you notice again, how does our Mishnah read? The first part of the Mishnah quotes the halacha that ultimately, again, if the father dies, the husband doesn't inherit his rights, his revocatory rights. Husband dies, father does inherit his revocatory rights. And then what happens? And then it says, Bezu yafa koach mikoach habal. So we'll say, in this way, the koach of the father is greater than the koach of the husband. To maintain Mishnaic symmetry, the Mishnah wanted to include a case of what? Where the power of the husband is greater than the power of the father. What's the case of where the power of the husband is greater than the power of the father? We'll say, what's that case? Bagrus. That if husband has the ability to annul the vows of his Bogeres wife, whereas a father has no revocatory power in his Bagrus daughter. So we'll say, so did the Mishnah need to state that case? Did it need to state it? No. Why didn't it need to state it? Why not? It was already taught us in Ksubis. It's only brought here ultimately to go ahead and maintain Mishnaic symmetry. Shkoyach, I'll stop over here. Shkoyach.